Sometimes the loneliest hearts carry the deepest wisdom. Sometimes the strongest men need the gentlest touch to heal. In the dusty town of Bitter Creek, 58-year-old Miss Madeline Sage has spent decades alone, watching life pass by her weathered porch. When 30-year-old Cowboy Jesse arrives at her door with tears in his eyes and blood on his hands from his first kill, everything changes. He's broken, innocent, and desperately needs someone who understands pain. Madeline sees something in this tender-hearted man that awakens feelings she thought were long buried. As darkness falls over the plains, she makes a choice that will transform them both. What happens when two lonely souls find exactly what they've been searching for in each other's arms? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hand-carved wooden cross above Madeline Sage's mantle had watched over her for 37 years, a testament to faith that had carried her through decades of solitude in the frontier town of Bitter Creek. Carved by her father's own hands before consumption took him, it bore witness to a life lived in service to others, while her own heart remained carefully guarded behind walls of propriety and resignation. At 58, Madeline had made peace with being called the old maid of Bitter Creek, though the whispers still stung when she heard them at the general store or after Sunday service. The townsfolk meant no real harm, she knew. In their minds, a woman her age without husband or children was simply an oddity to be pitied, like a flower that had forgotten to bloom. They didn't understand that some flowers chose their own season. Her weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared her evening meal, the same routine she'd followed for more years than she cared to count. A simple plate of cornbread and beans, eaten at the pine table her father had built when she was just a girl with dreams of filling a house with laughter and little voices. Those dreams had been carefully folded away, like her mother's china, too precious and fragile for everyday use. The homestead sat on the edge of town, close enough to hear the church bells on Sunday mornings, but far enough to escape the constant scrutiny of neighbors. 2 rooms downstairs, a kitchen that opened into a sitting area dominated by the stone fireplace and its watching cross, and a small bedroom upstairs under the eaves where she'd slept alone for more nights than any woman should have to count. Madeline had dedicated her life to others in the ways a spinster could. She taught Sunday school to children who would grow up and have families of their own. She sat with the sick when the doctor couldn't be found, mixing herbal remedies her mother had taught her and offering comfort with hands that had learned to heal everything except her own loneliness. When influenza swept through Bitter Creek, 3 winters passed, she'd moved from house to house like an angel of mercy, never once falling ill herself, as if her purpose was too strong to be felled by mortal sickness. The town appreciated her service, of course. They nodded respectfully when she passed, included her in church socials, and ensured she never wanted for necessities. But appreciation was a cold companion on winter nights when the wind howled across the plains and rattled the windows of her too quiet house. She'd had her chance at love once. Thomas Whitfield, a banker's son with gentle eyes and careful manners, had courted her properly when she was 21 and still believed in storybook endings. He'd spoken of marriage, of the home they'd build together, of the children who would call her Mama. But the war came calling, with its terrible hunger for young men, and Thomas answered with the same noble heart that had drawn her to him. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a boy who couldn't meet her eyes as he handed her the envelope that would change everything. Thomas had fallen at Antietam, one of thousands who would never return to the women who waited. Madeline had worn black for a year, then grey for another, and by the time she'd returned to wearing colours, the other young men had found wives among the girls who hadn't spent 2 years in mourning. She told herself it didn't matter, that her heart had died with Thomas on that Maryland battlefield. For 37 years, she'd almost believed it. Now, as dusk painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Madeline sat in her father's, old rocking chair on the front porch, watching the sun surrender to another day. This was her favorite hour, when the harsh light softened and the world seemed to hold its breath before night fell. In this gentle light, she could almost imagine a different life, one where voices called out greetings from the yard, where children's laughter carried on the evening breeze, where someone waited inside for her return. The sound of hoofbeats broke through her reverie, growing louder as they approached along the dusty road that led to town. Visitors were rare at this hour, and Madeline felt a flutter of concern as she recognized the unsteady gait of a horse pushed too hard. Through the gathering twilight, she could make out a rider slumped forward in the saddle, barely maintaining his seat. As the horse drew closer, she could see it was a young man, tall and broad-shouldered, even in his obvious distress. His hat had fallen back, revealing hair the color of wheat at harvest time, and his clothes were those of a working cowboy, worn leather chaps, a shirt that had seen better days, and boots that spoke of long hours in the stirrup. But it was the way he held himself that caught her attention, like a man carrying a weight too heavy for his soul to bear. The horse, sensing sanctuary, turned toward her gate without guidance from its rider. As they drew nearer, Madeline could see the young man's face was streaked with tears that caught the dying light, and there was something dark stained across the front of his shirt. Her heart, which had learned to protect itself through decades of careful distance, responded before her mind could stop it. Jesse Calhoun was 30 years old and had never killed a man before tonight. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold and impossible to dislodge. His hands, steady enough to gentle the wildest horse or thread a needle by candlelight, trembled now as they held the reins. The blood on his shirt, another man's blood, had dried to a rusty brown that seemed to mock his earlier innocence. He'd never meant for it to happen. Jesse was known throughout the territory as a man who settled disputes with words rather than weapons, who could calm a spooked animal or a heated argument with equal skill. But Kurt Brennan had been 3 sheets to the wind and spoiling for a fight, and when he'd drawn his gun in Murphy's saloon, claiming Jesse had cheated at cards, there'd been no choice but to respond. The shot had echoed like thunder in the crowded room, and Brennan had looked almost surprised as he collapsed, the unfired pistol falling from his fingers to clatter on the sawdust floor. Jesse had stared at the spreading crimson beneath the fallen man, his own smoking gun suddenly feeling like a foreign object in his hand. The saloon had fallen silent, except for the tick of the clock above the bar, marking the seconds that separated the man Jesse had been from the man he'd become. Self-defense, the sheriff had ruled. Clear as daylight, with a dozen witnesses to swear Brennan had drawn first. No charges would be filed and Jesse was free to go. But freedom felt like a mockery when it came with the weight of a man's death. Even a man like Brennan, who'd made enemies of half the territory with his drinking and fighting. Jesse had stumbled from the saloon into the night, seeking only distance from the scene and the eyes of those who'd witnessed his transformation from peaceful cowboy to killer. His horse had carried him without direction, following instincts older than civilization towards shelter and safety. Now, as the gentle light of an oil lamp glowed through the windows of a small homestead, Jesse felt his tenuous hold on composure beginning to crumble. The woman who rose from the porch chair moved with the grace of someone accustomed to her own company, unhurried and deliberate. Even through his haze of grief and shock, Jesse could see she was no young girl, but a woman of middle years, her dark hair streaked with silver, and her dress the simple, practical garment of someone who worked with her hands. But there was something in her bearing, a dignity that spoke of inner strength and a kindness that seemed to radiate from her very presence. "Easy now," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to calming frightened creatures. She approached his horse slowly, her movements careful and non-threatening. "You look like you've had a hard ride." Jesse tried to speak, to explain his presence at her door, but the words tangled in his throat. The tears he'd fought since leaving, Town returned with interest, and he found himself sliding from the saddle more than dismounting, his legs unsteady beneath him. The woman caught his arm as he stumbled, her touch warm and steady. "There now," she murmured, her voice holding the same tone she might use with a wounded animal. "Whatever's happened, you're safe here. My name is Madeline Sage, and this is my home. You're welcome to it." The simple kindness in her words broke something loose inside Jesse's chest, and he found himself sobbing like a child, great heaving breaths that shook his entire frame. He was dimly aware of her gentle hands guiding him toward the porch, of being settled into a chair that still held the warmth of her body, of a soft murmur of comfort that asked no questions and demanded no explanations. "I killed a man tonight," he whispered when he could finally speak, the words falling into the quiet evening like stones into still water. "God help me, I killed a man." Madeline Sage looked at this broken cowboy, this child in a man's body who'd stumbled into her carefully ordered world, and felt something stir that she'd thought was buried forever. It wasn't just compassion, though, that flowed freely. It was recognition. Here was another soul acquainted with pain, another heart that understood the weight of carrying burdens too heavy for one person alone. "What's your name, son?" she asked, gently settling back into her chair beside him. "Jesse," he managed, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Jesse Calhoun." "Well, Jesse Calhoun," Madeline said, her voice steady as stone, "it seems like you need a safe place tonight. And I've got more space than I know what to do with." She paused, studying his face in the lamplight. "Why don't you tell me what happened? Sometimes the telling helps." And in the gathering darkness of a frontier evening, with the cross watching over them from inside the house and the vast prairie stretching endlessly around them, two lonely souls began a conversation that would change the course of both their lives forever. Jesse's blood-stained shirt hung like a ghost between them, the dark stains catching the lamplight as he struggled to find words for what had transpired in Murphy's saloon. Madeline waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that rushing a wounded soul only drove it deeper into hiding. She'd seen enough pain in her years of tending the sick and comforting the grieving to recognize when a man was drowning in his own guilt. "It was self-defense," Jesse said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sheriff Hawkins said so himself. Dozen witnesses saw Brennan draw first." He looked down at his hands, still trembling despite his efforts to control them. "But that don't make it sit any easier." Madeline rose from her chair without a word, disappearing into the house. Jesse heard the soft sound of her movements inside, water being poured, something being taken from a shelf. When she returned, she carried a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and a small bottle of what looked like whiskey. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward his shirt. Jesse hesitated, suddenly aware of how he must look. Wild-eyed and blood-stained, a stranger who'd appeared at her door like some harbinger of violence. But there was no fear in her eyes, only a calm determination that reminded him of his mother in the moments before she died, when pain had stripped away everything but love. He nodded, allowing her to help him out of the ruined shirt. The evening air was cool against his skin, but her touch was warm as she began to clean the blood from his hands and arms with gentle, methodical strokes. The water in the basin turned pink, then red, carrying away the physical evidence of his encounter with mortality. "Kurt Brennan," she said, not making it a question. "You knew him?" Everyone in 3 counties knew Kurt Brennan. Madeline wrung out the cloth, her movements economical and sure. He'd been looking for trouble since he was old enough to hold a bottle. The wonder isn't that someone finally had to defend themselves against him. It's that it took this long. Jesse looked at her in surprise. "You don't think I'm a murderer? I think you're a young man who did what he had to do to stay alive." She met his eyes directly, and Jesse felt something unknot in his chest at the complete absence of judgment there. "And I think you're suffering for it in a way that tells me everything I need to know about your character." The simple acceptance in her words broke down the last of Jesse's defenses. The story poured out of him. how he'd been passing through Bitter Creek on his way to a job at the Morrison Ranch, how he'd stopped at Murphy's for a meal and ended up in a card game with some local men. Brennan had been drinking heavily, losing steadily, and growing more belligerent with each hand. "He called me a cheat," Jesse said, his voice thick with remembered fear. "Said I was dealing from the bottom of the deck. I tried to leave even. Offered to give back my winnings, but he wouldn't let it go. When he went for his gun, He stopped, unable to finish. "You survived," Madeline said firmly. "That's what you did. You survived." She finished cleaning his hands and arms, then disappeared again, returning this time with one of her father's old shirts. Soft cotton worn smooth by years of washing. It was too small across the shoulders, but would serve until morning. As Jesse pulled it on, he caught the faint scent of lavender and something else, the indefinable smell of a home where someone cared. "What happens now?" he asked. "I mean, where do I go from here?" Madeline settled back into her chair, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "That depends on what you're running from, and what you're running to." "I don't know about running to anything," Jesse admitted. "Right now I'm just trying to get away from the feeling that I've got blood on my hands that won't ever wash clean." "The blood will fade," Madeline said quietly. "The question is whether you'll let the guilt eat you alive, or whether you'll find a way to live with what you've done." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through the grass, the soft snorting of Jesse's horse as it grazed. Near the fence, the familiar sounds seemed to wrap around them like a blanket, offering a peace that Jesse hadn't felt since the moment he'd pulled the trigger. "I've never taken a life before," he said eventually. "Never even come close. My pa always said a man's gun should be his last resort, not his first. Sounds like a wise man. He was. Died when I was 15. Horse kicked him in the head, left me to make my own way." Jesse's voice carried the weight of old grief, easier to bear than the fresh wound, but still present. "I've been drifting ever since, picking up work where I could find it. Never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots. And what about family? A wife, perhaps?" Jesse shook his head, and something in the gesture made Madeline's heart skip unexpectedly. "Never found anyone who wanted to take on a wandering cowboy with nothing but a horse and a bedroll to his name." "Their loss," Madeline said before she could stop herself, then felt heat rise in her cheeks at her boldness. Jesse looked at her with surprise, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away from both of them. In the gentle lamplight, Madeline could see the boy he must have been, open-hearted and trusting, with eyes that held depths she was only beginning to fathom. And Jesse saw not the spinster the town whispered about, but a woman of quiet strength and unexpected beauty, someone who'd learned to tend wounds without flinching. "You're very kind, Miss Sage." "Madeline," she corrected, "and kindness has nothing to do with it. I'm simply stating a fact." The sound of hoofbeats on the road made them both look up. A rider was approaching at a leisurely pace, and as the figure drew closer, Madeline recognized the portly shape of Dr. Matthews, returning from a call. He slowed as he passed the gate, clearly curious about the stranger's horse in her yard. "Evening." "Madeline," he called out. "Everything all right?" "Just fine, Doctor," she replied, her voice carrying easily across the distance. "Mr. Calhoun here had some trouble in town and needed a place to rest." Dr. Matthews nodded, but Jesse could see the questions in his eyes. By morning, half the town would know that the old maid had taken in the young cowboy who'd killed Kurt. Brennan. The thought should have bothered him, but somehow, with Madeline's steady presence beside him, it seemed less important than it had an hour ago. "You sure about this?" Jesse asked after the doctor had ridden on. "Taking me in, I mean." "People will talk." Madeline's laugh was soft but genuine. "They've been talking about me for 37 years. I doubt one more night will make much difference." But even as she spoke the words, Madeline felt a tremor of uncertainty. Not about helping Jesse. That felt as natural as breathing. The uncertainty came from the way her pulse quickened when he looked at her directly, from the way her fingers had lingered on his skin as she'd cleaned away the blood. At 58, she'd thought herself long past such foolishness, but apparently the heart had its own timeline that paid no attention to the calendar. "I should probably move on in the morning," Jesse said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Should probably," Madeline agreed, though the thought of him leaving already felt like a loss. "But there's no rush. Plenty of time to decide what comes next." As if summoned by their conversation, a coyote's howl rose from somewhere out on the prairie, lonely and wild. It was answered by another, then another, until the night was filled with their ancient song. Jesse found himself listening with an attention he'd never paid before, as if the sound carried a message meant specifically. "Over him, they're singing about freedom," Madeline said, following his gaze toward the darkness beyond her fence. "Sounds more like loneliness to me." "Maybe they're the same thing," she replied, and Jesse turned to look at her with new eyes. In that moment, as the coyotes sang their wild songs and the prairie wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, both Jesse and Madeline felt the first stirring of something that would change everything. Neither could have named it yet, but it lived in the space between them like a promise waiting to be kept. Madeline's mother's quilting needle lay tucked in its small wooden case on the kitchen windowsill, catching the first light of dawn like a silver promise. The delicate tool had passed through 3 generations of women, each learning the art of mending what was broken, of taking scattered pieces and making them whole again. As Madeline prepared breakfast, she found herself thinking about the careful patience required for such work, how rushing only created tangles, how the most beautiful patterns emerged from the slowest, most deliberate stitches. Jesse woke to the sound of her moving quietly about the kitchen below, the soft clatter of dishes, and the gentle whistle of a kettle coming to boil. For a moment, disoriented by sleep and unfamiliar surroundings, he couldn't remember where he was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back, along with the extraordinary kindness of the woman who'd taken him in without question. He'd slept better than he had any right to, considering the circumstances. Madeline had insisted he take her father's old room upstairs, while she made do with a pallet by the fire. The small space under the eaves was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the prairie. He'd expected to lie awake, wrestling with guilt and memory, but exhaustion had claimed him almost immediately. Now, as morning light filtered through the gingham curtains, Jesse felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The simple pleasure of waking in a place where he was wanted. It was a dangerous feeling, he knew. A drifter couldn't afford to get attached to places or people, but there was something about Madeline Sage that made him want to ignore that hard-learned wisdom. Downstairs, Madeline was setting 2 places at the pine table, her movements economical and sure. She'd braided her hair in a simple style that revealed the elegant line of her neck, and she wore a blue dress that brought out the deeper blue of her eyes. Jesse found himself staring longer than was polite, struck by how the morning light seemed to soften the lines around her eyes and reveal the beauty that years and solitude had quietly refined. "Good morning," she said, looking up with a smile that made something warm unfurl in his chest. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I deserved," Jesse replied, taking the chair she indicated. "Thank you for everything." "Nonsense. Anyone would have done the same." Jesse shook his head. "No, ma'am, they wouldn't have. Most folks would have sent me on my way, blood or no blood." Madeline poured coffee from a blue enamel pot, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen. "Then most folks are fools. A person in need is a person in need, regardless of the circumstances that brought them to your door." As they ate, eggs from her small flock of hens, biscuits still warm from the oven, preserves made from wild blackberries she'd gathered the previous summer, Jesse found himself studying his hostess with growing curiosity. There was something almost regal about the way she carried herself, a quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength and hard-won wisdom. Yet beneath that composed exterior, he sensed depths he was only beginning to fathom. "You live here alone?" he asked, then immediately regretted the question's bluntness. "For many years now," Madeline replied without apparent offense. "My father built this place when I was just a girl. After he passed, I saw no reason to leave. Don't you get lonely?" The question hung between them for a moment, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to explore. Madeline took a careful sip of her coffee before answering. "I've learned to find company in other things, books, my work with the church, the changing seasons. Loneliness is a choice, Mr. Calhoun. There's always something that needs tending if you're willing to look for it." After breakfast, Jessie insisted on helping with the morning chores despite Madeline's protests. He was a natural with animals, she noticed, moving among her small flock of chickens with the same gentle authority he'd shown with his horse the night before. When one of the hens, a cantankerous Rhode Island red named Prudence, tried to peck him, he simply sidestepped her attack and continued gathering eggs as if nothing had happened. "She's testing you," Madeline observed from the doorway of the chicken coop. "Most creatures do at first," Jessie replied, carefully placing another egg in the basket. "Can't blame them. Trust has to be earned." There was something in the way he said it that made Madeline wonder what he'd done to earn the wariness that seemed as much a part of him as his sun-weathered skin. But she held her questions, sensing that pushing would only make him retreat. They worked in comfortable silence, Jessie's presence transforming the familiar routine of her morning chores into something altogether different. When he lifted a heavy bucket of water for the horses without being asked, when he automatically latched the chicken coop behind him, when he paused to scratch the ears of her old barn cat, these small gestures spoke of a man accustomed to pulling his weight. Someone raised to see work as a form of respect. "You don't have to do this," Madeline said, as Jessie began repairing a loose board on the porch steps. "Want to," he replied, testing the fit of the board. "Besides, it's the least I can do after your kindness." "It's not about debt, Jessie." He looked up at her then, his hands stilling on the hammer. "What is it about?" The question caught her off guard, mainly because she wasn't sure she knew the answer herself. All she knew was that having him here felt right in a way that both comforted and frightened her. At 58, she thought she was past the age of surprises, but Jessie Calhoun was proving her assumptions wrong at every turn. "I suppose it's about human decency," she said finally, though the words felt incomplete even as she spoke them. Jessie nodded and returned to his work, but Madeline caught the small smile that played at the corners of his mouth. As the morning wore on, she found herself stealing glances at him as he moved about her small domain, the way his shoulders filled out her father's old shirt, the careful precision of his movements, the quiet competence that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a banked fire. When the sun climbed high enough to make work uncomfortable, they retreated to the shade of the porch. Madeline brought out a pitcher of cool water flavored with mint from her garden, and they sat in the rocking chairs, watching the heat shimmer rise from the prairie grass. "Beautiful country," Jessie observed, his gaze sweeping across the endless expanse of grassland. "It grows on you," Madeline agreed. "At first it seems like nothing but emptiness, but after a while you begin to see the subtleties. The way the grass changes color with the wind, how the light is different at every hour of the day. It has its own kind of beauty, if you're patient enough to discover it." Jessie turned to look at her, struck by something in her voice that suggested she was talking about more than just the landscape. In profile, with the gentle breeze stirring, the silver threads in her dark hair, she looked like someone who'd learned to find beauty in unexpected places, including, perhaps, in herself. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "All my life, except for a brief time when I thought I might leave." Her voice carried the weight of old decisions, roads not taken. "But this is home. Sometimes you don't fully appreciate what you have, until you consider losing it." The afternoon was wearing on when they heard the approach of a wagon. Madeline recognized the determined pace before she could make out the driver. Mrs. Henderson from town, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of Bitter Creek's moral standards. Jesse's father's silver harmonica had been his most treasured possession, carried through years of wandering in the worn leather pouch that now rested on Madeline's kitchen table. The instrument bore the scratches and dents of countless evenings. Around campfires, its surface polished smooth by hands that had known both gentleness and hard work. As Jesse lifted it to his lips in the gathering dusk, the first mournful notes seemed to carry with them the weight of all his unshed tears. Mrs. Henderson's visit that afternoon had been everything Madeline expected and more. The banker's wife had arrived with the righteous determination of someone on a holy mission. Her steel-grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. She'd made it clear that decent folks were concerned about the propriety of a single woman harboring a known killer, regardless of the circumstances. "I'm sure your heart is in the right place, Madeline," she'd said, her voice dripping with false concern. "But people are talking. A woman of your position can't afford to have her reputation questioned." Jesse had withdrawn to the barn during the visit, but Madeline knew he'd heard every word through the thin walls. When Mrs. Henderson finally departed, her mission accomplished. In her own mind, if not in reality, Jesse had emerged with something new in his expression, a careful distance that hadn't been there before. "She's not wrong, you know," he'd said quietly, "about what people will think." "Let them think what they will," Madeline had replied, but she'd seen the doubt creeping into his eyes like storm clouds on a clear horizon. Now, as the harmonica's melody drifted across the evening air, Madeline found herself studying Jesse's profile in the lamplight. There was something achingly young about him when he played, as if the music stripped away the years of hard living and revealed the boy he'd been before life taught him to be careful with his heart. "Your father taught you to play?" she asked. "When he lowered the instrument, he did. Said music was food for the soul, especially when your belly was empty and your prospects were lean." Jesse's smile was tinged with old sadness. He wasn't much for words, but he could make that harmonica sing like an angel. "Play something else," Madeline requested, settling deeper into her chair. Jesse obliged, this time choosing a sweeter melody that spoke of meadows and gentle rain rather than lonely trails and lost love. As the notes filled the evening air, Madeline felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of bonds she'd thought were permanent, a stirring of possibilities she'd believed were long past. "You have a gift," she said when the song ended. "Pa always said God gives everyone something. Music was mine, I suppose. What else did your father teach you?" Jesse was quiet for a moment, turning the harmonica over in his hands. "How to read the weather, how to gentle a spooked horse, how to judge a man's character by the way he treats something weaker than himself." He paused, his voice growing softer. "How to treat a woman with respect, even if, especially if, you care about her." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Madeline felt her pulse quicken, aware suddenly of how alone they were, how the rest of the world had faded away until there was nothing but this porch, these chairs, this man whose presence had awakened something she'd thought was safely buried. "He sounds like a good man," she managed. "He was. Sometimes I wonder what he'd think of how I turned out. A drifter with no home, no family, blood on his hands." "I think he'd be proud," Madeline said firmly. "You defended yourself, Jesse. You showed courage when it would have been easier to run. That takes character." Jesse looked at her then, really looked, and Madeline felt exposed in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. In his eyes, she saw not the spinster the town pitied, but something altogether different. A woman worthy of attention, of admiration, perhaps even of something deeper. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. "What did you expect?" "Someone. Bitter. Someone who'd given up on life." He shook his head slowly. "Instead, I find someone who—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Someone who what? Someone who makes me want to stay in one place for the first time in 15 years. The confession fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the careful equilibrium they'd maintained. Madeline felt her breath catch, her heart racing in a way that reminded her she was still a woman, still capable of being stirred by a man's honest words. "Jessie, I know," he said quickly. "I know it's impossible. The age difference, what people would say, the fact that I've got nothing to offer someone like you, someone like me." Madeline's voice was sharper than she'd intended, but the phrase stung more than it should have. Someone good, someone respected, someone who deserves better than a wandering cowboy with a questionable past. Madeline rose from her chair, moved by an impulse she didn't fully understand. In 3 steps, she was standing before him, close enough to see the flecks of green in his brown eyes, close enough to smell the lingering scent of sage and leather that clung to his clothes. "Don't you dare tell me what I deserve," she said, her voice low but intense. "I've spent 37 years letting other people make those decisions for me, and I'm tired of it." Jessie stared up at her, stunned by the passion in her voice, by the way the lamplight caught the fire in her eyes. This was not the resigned spinster he'd expected, but a woman whose spirit had been banked, not extinguished. A woman who was just beginning to remember her own power. "Madeline, I'm 58 years old, Jessie. I've lived more than half my life, and most of it I've spent being what other people expected me to be. The dutiful daughter, the helpful neighbor, the spinster who minds her own business and doesn't ask for more than she's given." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "But maybe, just maybe, I'm tired of being grateful for scraps when there's a whole feast waiting if I'm brave enough to reach for it." The silence that followed was charged with possibility and danger. Jessie could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, could see the rapid rise and fall of Madeline's chest as she fought to control emotions that had clearly been suppressed too long. Without thinking, he reached up and took her hand, marveling at how perfectly her fingers fit between his. "What are you saying?" he asked softly. "I'm saying that maybe Mrs. Henderson is right. Maybe I am risking my reputation, but maybe some things are worth the risk." Jessie stood slowly, never releasing her hand until they were facing each other in the golden circle of lamplight. The night sounds of the prairie seemed muted, as if the whole world was holding its breath to see what would happen next. "I should leave," he whispered, but his feet remained planted, his hand still holding hers. "Should is a cold companion," Madeline replied, echoing something her mother had once told her about missed opportunities and roads not taken. "I've lived with should for most of my adult life, and it's never once warmed my bed or my heart." The dome. Last words were barely audible, but they might as well have been shouted for the impact they had on Jessie. He felt something break loose inside him, some careful control he'd maintained since arriving at her door. Before he could second-guess himself, he lifted his free hand to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her cheekbone. "Madeline," he breathed, and in that single word was a question, a plea and a promise all at once. Her answer came not in words, but in the way she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed, as if savoring a sensation she'd almost forgotten existed. When she opened them again, Jessie saw his own longing reflected there, tempered by wisdom, but no less real for its maturity. The wedding dress hung in Madeline's cedar chest like a ghost of dreams deferred, its ivory silk still pristine after 37 years of waiting. She'd sewn it herself during the long winter months before Thomas was to return from the war, each tiny stitch a prayer for the future they'd planned together. The delicate pearl buttons still gleamed. The hand-embroidered roses along the bodice still held their perfect form, as if time itself had held its breath, waiting for a love that never came home. Jessie discovered it by accident on his 3rd day at the homestead, when Madeline had asked him to fetch extra blankets from the chest in her room. His hands had found the dress first, and he'd lifted it with the reverence due to something sacred, understanding instinctively that he was holding more than fabric and thread. "I was going to be married once," Madeline said from the doorway. her voice carrying the weight of old grief worn smooth by time. She hadn't meant to tell him, but something about the way he held the dress with such careful tenderness made the words spill out before she could stop them. Jessie turned slowly, the dress still cradled in his arms. What happened? The war. Two simple words that contained a universe of loss. Thomas Whitfield, he was... She paused, searching for words that could capture what he'd meant to her. He was going to be my husband. Jessie laid the dress carefully back in the chest. His movements deliberate and respectful. When he straightened, Madeline was surprised to see moisture in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said simply, and somehow those two words carried more comfort than all the platitudes she'd heard over the years. It was a long time ago. Madeline moved to sit on the edge of her bed, her hands smoothing the faded quilt her mother had made. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like it happened to someone else entirely." Jessie sat beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance, even as every instinct urged him closer. "Do you still love him?" The question surprised her with its directness, but she found she appreciated his honesty. "I loved who we were together, two young people with our whole lives ahead of us. But we never had the chance to discover who we'd become as husband and wife, through all the years that marriage brings." She turned to look at him, struck again by the genuine compassion in his eyes. "I think I loved the promise of him more than the reality. Does that make me a terrible person?" "It makes you human," Jessie replied, "and honest in a way most people never learn to be." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of shared confidences settling between them like a warm blanket. Madeline found herself studying Jessie's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair caught the afternoon light streaming through her window, the careful way he held himself as if afraid his very presence might be an imposition. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "Have you ever been in love?" Jessie's smile was rueful. "Thought I was, a time or two. But looking back, I think I was more in love with the idea of settling down than with the actual women involved." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "Hard to love someone properly when you're always looking toward the horizon, wondering what's beyond the next hill. And now?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to name. Jessie turned to face her fully, and Madeline felt her breath catch at the intensity of his gaze. "Now I'm beginning to understand the difference between wanting to run and wanting to stay." Before Madeline could respond, the sound of approaching voices made them both freeze. Through the window, they could see a small group of townspeople approaching, 3 men and 2 women, all wearing the grim expressions of people on an unpleasant mission. "Hell," Jessie muttered, then immediately colored at his language. "Sorry, I..." "Don't apologize," Madeline said, standing quickly. "I'm thinking much the same thing." They descended the stairs together, and Madeline was surprised to realize that Jessie's presence beside her felt natural, protective without being possessive. When they stepped onto the porch, she recognized the delegation. Reverend Morrison, Mayor Hutchins, Mrs. Henderson, of course, Mrs. Potter from the general store, and Tom Bradley, who owned the largest ranch in the county. "Madeline," Reverend Morrison began, his tone carrying the weight of moral authority, "we've come to speak with you about this situation." "What situation would that be?" Madeline asked, her voice level despite the hammering of her heart. "You know perfectly well what situation," Mrs. Henderson interjected, her eyes flicking dismissively over Jessie. "A decent woman doesn't harbor strange men in her home, especially men with blood on their hands." Jessie stepped forward, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "If you have something to say about me, ma'am, I'd appreciate you saying it to my face, rather than talking around me like I'm not here." "We're not talking to you at all," Tom Bradley said coldly. "We're talking to Miss Sage about the damage she's doing to her reputation and to the moral standing of this community." "Damage?" Madeline's voice rose despite her efforts to remain calm. "What damage comes from offering shelter to someone in need?" "People are talking, Madeline," Mayor Hutchins said, his tone more conciliatory than the others. "You know how it is in a small town. Appearances matter more than Christian. Charity? Jessie asked, and Madeline felt a surge of warmth at his quiet defense. Reverend Morrison's face darkened. Don't presume to lecture us about Christian duty, young man. We know what happened at Murphy's saloon. Whatever the sheriff might have ruled, the fact remains that you killed a man. In self-defense, Madeline said firmly, with a dozen witnesses to prove it. The circumstances don't change the impropriety of the situation, Mrs. Potter added. An unmarried woman alone with a man. It's scandalous. Jessie felt his temper beginning to fray, but Madeline's hand on his arm steadied him. When he looked at her, he saw not embarrassment or apology, but a quiet fury that surprised him with its intensity. I see, Madeline said, her voice dangerously calm. So, in your opinion, I should have turned away someone who needed help simply to preserve appearances? You should have sent him to the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson said firmly, or to the church. There are proper channels for these things. Proper channels, Madeline repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. How wonderfully convenient for all of you to have proper channels that allow you to feel charitable without actually having to extend yourselves. The delegation shifted uncomfortably, clearly not having expected this level of resistance from the woman they'd come to lecture. We're trying to help you, Madeline, Reverend Morrison said. Before this goes too far, Madeline stepped closer to Jessie, and he felt the deliberate nature of the gesture. And what exactly constitutes too far in your estimation? We think you know, Tom Bradley said meaningfully. The implications in his tone made Jessie's hands clench into fists. But again, Madeline's touch kept him from responding with the violence that threatened to surface. I think, Madeline said with deadly quiet, that you should all leave my property. Now. Madeline, Reverend Morrison began. Now, she repeated, and there was steel in her voice that brooked no argument. The delegation retreated, but their parting looks promised that this confrontation was far from over. As their voices faded into the distance, Jessie turned to Madeline with concern and admiration warring in his expression. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Yes, Madeline replied, her hand still resting on his arm. I did, and in that moment, Jessie realized that his feelings for this remarkable woman had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The oil lamp by Madeline's bedside had burned through countless lonely nights, its gentle flame a constant companion through decades of solitude. Tonight, as she adjusted the wick with trembling fingers, the warm glow seemed different, charged with possibility and weighted with the knowledge that some thresholds, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The lamp's steady light would bear witness to whatever came next, illuminating not just the darkness of her room, but the shadows of her heart that had remained unexplored for far too long. The morning after the townspeople's visit brought an uncomfortable tension that settled over the homestead like morning fog. Jessie moved through his chores with mechanical precision, his earlier ease replaced by a careful distance that made Madeline's chest ache with unexpected loss. She could see him retreating into himself, rebuilding the walls that they're growing. Intimacy had begun to erode. You're planning to leave, she said as they sat down to breakfast, the words falling between them like stones. Jessie's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. It might be for the best. For whom? For you. Your reputation, your standing in the community. I can't be the reason you lose all of that. Madeline set down her fork with deliberate care. And what if I'm willing to lose it? You don't mean that, don't I? Her voice carried a note of challenge that made Jessie look up sharply. You think you know what I value, what I'm willing to sacrifice. I think you've lived here your whole life, and I've been here 3 days. I think these people are your family, your community, and I'm just what? Jessie struggled for words, his hands gripping his coffee cup as if it were an anchor, just a drifter who killed a man and brought trouble to your door. The pain in his voice cut through Madeline's frustration, reminding her that beneath his growing confidence lay a deep well of self-doubt. She reached across the table and covered his hands with hers, feeling the tremor that ran through him at her touch. "Jesse, look at me." He raised his eyes reluctantly, and she saw in them the lost boy he must have been, orphaned young, forced to make his own way in a world that offered little mercy to the vulnerable. "You are not just anything," she said firmly. "You are a good man who's known hardship and responded with kindness instead of bitterness. You are someone who works without being asked, who treats animals with gentleness, who plays music that makes my heart remember what joy feels like." Her voice grew softer. "You are someone who makes me want to be brave." "Brave?" Jesse's voice was barely above a whisper. "Brave enough to want something for myself, instead of always settling for what others think I should have. Brave enough to admit that I care about you, more than I should, more than is proper, more than is probably wise." The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning a chasm. Jesse stared at their joined hands, his mind reeling from the implications of her words. At 30, he'd thought he understood the nature of attraction, of desire, of the pull between man and woman. But what he felt for Madeline transcended anything in his experience. Part desire, part reverence, part desperate gratitude for being seen as worthy of love. "Madeline," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. That is, I don't know how to..." "How to what?" He looked up at her then, his cheeks coloring with embarrassment. "How to love a woman properly. How to be what you deserve." The admission was so honest, so vulnerable, that Madeline felt her heart break open with tenderness. This man, this strong, capable, beautiful man, was confessing his inexperience with the same courage another might admit to mortal fear. "What makes you think I know any better?" she asked gently. "I'm 58 years old, and I've never been touched by a man with anything more than polite respect. I've never shared a bed with anyone, never experienced the intimacy that married couples take for granted." Her smile was tremulous but real. "We'd be learning together." Jesse's breath caught at the implication in her words. "Are you saying..." "I'm saying that perhaps it's time for both of us to stop living half-lives. I'm saying that whatever this is between us, this feeling, this connection, it's real and it deserves to be honored rather than hidden away like something shameful." The silence that followed was charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. Jesse could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, could see the pulse flutter at the base of Madeline's throat. The morning light streaming through the kitchen window seemed to illuminate not just their faces, but the crossroads at which they stood. "The town will never accept it," Jesse said quietly. "Then perhaps it's time I stopped caring what the town accepts. They could shun you completely, make your life here impossible. And what if they do?" Madeline's voice grew stronger with each word. "What if they turn their backs on me for choosing love over loneliness? Would that be such a tragedy?" Jesse studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or regret. Instead, he found a determination that took his breath away. A woman who had finally decided to claim her own happiness regardless of the cost. "What are you proposing?" he asked, though his heart was already racing ahead to possibilities his mind barely dared consider. "I'm proposing that we stop pretending this is temporary, that we stop acting like what's growing between us is something to be ashamed of." Madeline's cheeks were flushed, but her voice was steady. "I'm proposing that tonight, when the sun sets and the world goes quiet, we stop running from what we both want." The words hit Jesse like a physical blow, leaving him breathless and dizzy. With want. He'd imagined this moment, dreamed of it if he was honest, but the reality of her proposition was more overwhelming than any fantasy. "Madeline," he breathed, and in that single word was a prayer, a question, and a surrender, all at once. "I know what I'm asking," she said softly. "I know what it means, what it could cost us both. But I also know that I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting fear make my choices for me." Jesse rose from his chair slowly, never breaking eye contact. When he moved around the table to stand before her, Madeline's breath quickened, but she didn't look away. Carefully, as if she were made of spun glass, he cupped her face in his hands. "Are you certain?" he asked, his thumbs tracing the delicate curve of her cheekbones. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Jessie leaned down then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. When their lips finally met, it was with a gentleness that spoke of reverence rather than passion. A first kiss that tasted of promise and possibility, of two souls finally brave enough to reach for what they needed most. When they broke apart, Jessie rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, as if memorizing the moment. "Tonight," Madeline whispered, and the single word contained a universe of possibility. "Tonight," Jessie agreed, and in his voice was the sound of a man finally coming home. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anticipation and preparation. Jessie found himself unable to concentrate on even the simplest tasks, his mind continually drifting to the promise that hung between them. Madeline moved through her familiar routines with deliberate care, as if performing a ritual that would sanctify what was to come. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber, they found themselves drawn together on the porch, where it had all begun. The oil lamp glowed softly through the window behind them, waiting to illuminate the night that would change everything. "I'll teach you tonight," Madeline whispered, her words carrying on the evening breeze like a vow, and Jessie felt his heart overflow with love for this remarkable woman who had chosen to trust him with her most precious gift, herself. The legal documents hidden behind the flour sacks in Madeline's pantry told a story that would rewrite everything Jessie thought he knew about the woman who had captured his heart. Yellowed with age, but still bearing the clear seals of the territorial government, the papers revealed a truth that Bitter Creek had carefully ignored for decades. Madeline Sage didn't just live in the town. She owned most of it. Jessie had discovered the documents by accident while helping Madeline reorganize her pantry. A loose board in the back wall had given way under pressure, revealing a hidden compartment that contained not just papers, but a small fortune in gold coins and banknotes. His hands had trembled as he read deed after deed, each one bearing Madeline's father's name and later transferred to her upon his death. The general store, the boarding house, 3/4 of the residential lots, even the land under the church, all of it belonged to the woman the town called the old maid, the spinster they pitied and patronized in equal measure. The woman who mended their clothes and tended their sick owned the very ground they walked on, yet she lived as simply as any farm wife, asking nothing and giving everything. "How long have you known?" Madeline asked from the pantry doorway, her voice steady despite the pallor that had crept across her face. Jessie turned slowly, the documents still clutched in his hands. "Just now. I was moving the flour sacks, and the board came loose." He stopped, studying her expression. "You're not surprised?" "No," Madeline said quietly. "I've been wondering when you'd find them, or when someone would." She moved into the small space, her presence filling it despite her modest stature. "I suppose I should have told you." "Why didn't you?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. Jessie could see the walls rising behind Madeline's eyes, the careful composure that had carried her through decades of hiding in plain sight. "Because," she said finally, "I wanted someone to see me for who I am, not what I own." Jessie set the papers down carefully, his mind reeling as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed began falling into place. "The way people treat you, the condescension, the pity. They have no idea," Madeline confirmed. "My father was very careful about that. He built his fortune quietly, buying land and properties through intermediaries, never letting on how much he'd accumulated. When he died, he left instructions that I should do the same." "But why?" Jessie struggled to understand. "You could live like a queen. You could have anything you wanted, go anywhere." "I tried that once." Madeline's voice carried the weight of old pain. "After Thomas died, I thought about leaving Bitter Creek behind. I had the means, certainly. I could have gone to San Francisco or even back east. I could have lived in luxury, surrounded by people who knew nothing of my past. What stopped you? I realized that running away wouldn't bring Thomas back. And more than that, I realized that the life I was imagining, all that wealth and comfort, it wasn't real. It was just another kind of prison, gold-plated instead of made of loneliness, but a prison all the same. Jesse picked up one of the banknotes, staring at the figure written there. More money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes of honest work. Hidden, away like a shameful secret. So you stayed, he said slowly, and let them think you were poor. I stayed and chose to live simply. There's a difference. Madeline's voice grew stronger, more certain. I kept enough to maintain the homestead and help when people were in real need, though I was careful to do it anonymously. The rest just accumulated. The rest could buy half the territory. The rest is just paper and metal. It can't buy the things that matter. Friendship, respect, love. She paused, her eyes searching his face. At least I hoped it couldn't. The implication hit Jesse like a physical blow. You think this changes how I feel about you? I think it changes everything, Madeline said, her voice breaking slightly despite her efforts to maintain control. I think you're looking at me right now and wondering if I was playing some kind of game, if I was laughing at you behind my... And while you worried about having nothing to offer me. Jesse stepped closer, the papers forgotten. Is that what you think of me? That I'm the kind of man who'd care more about your money than... I don't know, Madeline admitted, and the honesty in her voice was more devastating than any accusation. I've spent 37 years watching how people change when they learn about wealth. I've seen friendship turn to servility, respect turn to greed, love turn to calculation. I don't know how you'll change. I won't change, Jesse said fiercely. But even as the words left his mouth, he could feel doubt creeping in around the edges. Not doubt about his feelings, those were as solid and true as bedrock, but doubt about everything else, about his place in her world, about what he could possibly offer her, about whether their connection was real or just the product of circumstances that were built on a lie. You're already changing, Madeline observed with devastating accuracy. I can see it in your eyes, the way you're looking at me, the way you're holding yourself. You're pulling away. Jesse wanted to deny it, but honesty was one of the few things he had left to offer her. I feel like a fool, he admitted. 3 days I've been here, worrying about being a burden, about having nothing to give you. And all the time I was letting you worry. I was enjoying the way you looked at me, like I was something precious, instead of something to be managed or manipulated. Madeline's composure cracked, revealing the vulnerability beneath. For 3 days, I felt like a woman, instead of a bank account with legs. The pain in her voice cut through Jesse's confusion, reminding him of what truly mattered. This was still Madeline, the woman who'd tended his wounds without asking questions, who'd defended him against the town's judgment, who'd shown him a kind of acceptance he'd never known existed. Money didn't change the gentle strength of her hands, or the wisdom in her eyes, or the way his heart raced when she smiled at him. You are precious, he said quietly, not because of what you own, but because of who you are. The money, it doesn't matter, doesn't it? Madeline's voice was barely above a whisper. When you think about what people will say now, not just about an old maid harboring a drifter, but about a wealthy woman and a poor cowboy, doesn't it matter then? Jesse felt the truth of her words like a knife between his ribs. The gossips would have a field day if they knew the truth. Instead of a scandalous affair, they'd see a calculated seduction, a rich woman amusing herself with a younger man. His feelings for her would be dismissed as fortune hunting, her feelings for him as the folly of a lonely spinster with more money than sense. They'd never believe it was real, he said, understanding flooding through him. No, Madeline agreed. They'd never believe that someone like me could inspire genuine affection from someone like you. They'd assume I was paying for companionship. One way or another, The cruelty of it took Jessie's breath away. Here was a woman who'd lived her entire adult life in service to others, who'd hidden her wealth specifically to avoid the kind of attention it would bring, and now even her chance. Yet love was tainted by the very fortune she'd tried to escape. What do we do? He asked, and the question encompassed more than just the immediate problem of the discovered documents. I don't know, Madeline admitted. For 37 years I've been hiding from this moment. The moment when someone I cared about would learn the truth and everything would change. Jessie studied her face, seeing not the wealthy landowner or the town's benefactor, but the woman who'd offered him sanctuary when he needed it most. The woman who'd been brave enough to reach for love despite the risks. The woman whose kiss had tasted like home. Maybe, he said slowly, it's time to stop hiding. What do you mean? I mean, maybe it's time for Bitter Creek to learn who you really are. All of who you are. Jessie's voice grew stronger as the idea took shape. They've spent decades taking your generosity for granted while treating you like an object of pity. Maybe it's time they understood exactly what they've been throwing away. Madeline stared at him, hope and terror warring in her expression. They'd never forgive me for the deception. Then they'd be fools, Jessie said firmly. And maybe it's time you stopped caring what fools think. In the small pantry, surrounded by the evidence of a secret that had shaped decades of loneliness, two people stood at the crossroads of truth and consequence, love and fear. Whatever they chose, there would be no going back to the careful distance they'd maintained, no returning to the simple story of a spinster and a drifter who'd found solace in each other's company. The real story was about to begin. Madeline's father's gold pocket watch had stopped ticking 37 years ago, frozen at the moment she'd received word of Thomas's death. She kept it in her dresser drawer, a reminder that time could stop when loss was too great to bear, but also that it could start again when the heart was ready to heal. Tonight, as she wound the watch with trembling fingers, its familiar tick resumed, steady, purposeful, marking moments that suddenly mattered again. The decision to reveal the truth about her wealth had been easier to make than to execute. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Bitter Creek, and by noon the next day, half the population had gathered in the street outside her homestead, their faces displaying various combinations of shock, anger, and calculation. The revelation that their poor spinster was actually the wealthiest person in 3 counties had shattered their comfortable assumptions about the natural order of things. Jessie stood beside her on the porch, his presence both anchor and sail. As she faced the crowd that had come seeking explanations, she could feel the weight of their expectations, their sense of betrayal at learning she'd hidden her true circumstances for so long. But underneath their indignation, she caught glimpses of something else, a dawning awareness of how badly they'd misjudged her, how thoughtlessly they'd dismissed someone who'd quietly shaped their lives for decades. "You've made fools of us all," Mayor Hutchins said, his voice tight with embarrassment. "Living like a pauper while you owned half the town. What were we supposed to think? You were supposed to think that circumstances don't define character," Madeline replied calmly. "You were supposed to realize that a person's worth isn't measured by their bank account." "Easy words when you have more money than the rest of us combined," Tom Bradley muttered, but there was less venom in his voice than might have been expected. "Is it?" Madeline challenged. "Do you think it's been easy watching people I've known my entire life treat me with pity and condescension? Do you think I've enjoyed being patted on the head like a faithful dog, while my own neighbors assumed I was too poor and pathetic to deserve their real respect?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably, several people having the grace to look ashamed. Mrs. Henderson, however, was not among them. "If you wanted respect, you should have earned it honestly, instead of playing games with people's perceptions," she said sharply. "Games?" Jesse stepped forward, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "You call a lifetime of service a game? You call tending your sick children without payment a game? You call sitting with your dying parents a game?" "We didn't know," someone began. "That's right," Madeline interrupted. "You didn't know, because you never bothered to look past your own assumptions. You saw a woman without a husband and decided that made her pitiable. You saw simple clothes and a modest lifestyle and assumed poverty. You never once considered that I might be choosing to live as I did." Reverend Morrison cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. "Nevertheless, Madeline, the deception—" "What deception?" Her voice rose slightly, decades of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. "Did I ever ask for charity? Did I ever claim to need help I didn't actually need? Or did I simply fail to correct your wrong assumptions about my circumstances?" The distinction was lost on Mrs. Henderson, who pressed forward with her attack. "And what about him?" she demanded, pointing at Jessie. "How much are you paying him to play the part of devoted admirer? How much is his affection worth?" The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Madeline felt Jessie go rigid beside her. This was the moment she'd dreaded, when their genuine connection would be twisted into something sordid and calculating. "Mrs. Henderson," Jessie said, his voice deadly quiet, "I'm going to ask you once to take that back." "Why should I? Everyone knows men like you don't court women like her unless there's money involved. Now we know where the money comes from." Jessie started forward, his hands clenched into fists, but Madeline caught his arm. She could feel the tremor of controlled rage running through him, the effort it took not to respond to the insult with violence. "Let me," she said quietly, then turned, to face the crowd with a dignity that made several people step back. "You want to know about Jesse Calhoun," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I'll tell you. He's a man who came to my door broken and bleeding, carrying guilt for something he couldn't have avoided. He's a man who works without being asked, who treats my animals with gentleness, who plays music that could make angels weep. He's a man who saw past my grey hair and lined face to something worth caring about." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. "And yes, he's a man who makes me remember what it feels like to be desired as a woman instead of tolerated as a burden. If that shocks you, if that offends your sensibilities, then perhaps you should examine why the idea of someone finding me attractive is so unbelievable." The crowd had gone silent, struck by the raw honesty in her words. Even Mrs. Henderson seemed momentarily at a loss for a response. "As for paying him," Madeline continued, "the only payment Jessie has received from me is kindness. The same kindness I would show to any person in need. If that's so foreign to your experience that you can't imagine it existing without financial motivation, then perhaps you should ask yourselves what that says about your own characters." Jessie felt his heart swell with pride and something deeper, a fierce protectiveness that had nothing to do with her money and everything to do with the courage she was showing in the face of their small-minded cruelty. "The truth is," Madeline said, her voice growing softer but no less certain, "I love him. I love his gentle strength, his honest heart, his willingness to see good in people who haven't always deserved it. I love the way he makes me laugh, the way he makes me feel like a woman instead of a spinster. And if that love costs me every friend I have in this town, so be it." The declaration hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Several women gasped audibly, while the men looked uncomfortable with such open emotion. But Jessie heard only the words that mattered, words he'd hoped for but never quite believed he'd hear. "And I love her," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Not her money, not her property, not what she can give me, her. I love her wisdom, her strength, her capacity for caring about people who've never appreciated what they had in her. I love the way she sees the best in everyone, even when they don't deserve it." He turned to face Madeline directly, no longer caring about the audience they'd drawn. "I love the way you take care of everything and everyone around you. I love that you chose to live simply because it felt right, not because you had to. I love that you saw something worth saving in a broken-down cowboy with blood on his hands." The crowd began to murmur among themselves, some beginning to drift away as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't a scandal they could dismiss, or a situation they could easily judge. This was two people who'd found something real in each other, something that transcended their circumstances. Dr. Matthews, who'd been silent through the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Seems to me," he said thoughtfully, "that we've all learned something today about making assumptions. Maybe it's time we started treating people based on what they do, rather than what we think we know about them." A few voices murmured agreement, but Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. "This is all very romantic," she said acidly, "but what happens when the novelty wears off? What happens when he gets tired of playing house with an old woman and decides to take his share of her fortune with him?" The cruelty of the words made several people wince, but it was Madeline who answered, her voice calm and certain. "Then I'll have had something beautiful for however long it lasted," she said simply. "I'd rather have one day of real love than a lifetime of empty safety." Jessie looked at her then with such naked adoration that even Mrs. Henderson fell silent. In his eyes, Madeline saw not the calculating look of a fortune hunter, but the wonder of a man who couldn't quite believe his good fortune in finding someone who loved him for exactly who he was. "Besides," Madeline added, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, "I'm not as helpless as you seem to think. 37 years of managing property and investments have taught me a thing or two about protecting what's mine." The crowd was definitely thinning now, people beginning to realize that their attempted intervention had failed spectacularly. The couple on the porch showed no signs of shame or regret, only a determination that spoke of decisions already made. As the last of the townspeople drifted away, Jessie and Madeline found themselves alone again, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the porch where this had all begun. The weight of their public declarations hung between them, making what had been tentative suddenly definite. "Well," Madeline said quietly, "I suppose there's no going back now. Do you want to go back?" She studied his face. This man who'd stood beside her against a hostile crowd, who'd declared his love without hesitation despite the cost it might bring. "No," she said firmly, "I don't want to go back. I want to go forward. With you, if you'll have me." Jessie's answer came not in words, but in the way he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, two people who'd found love against all odds stood together on the threshold of a future they would create together. The watch in Madeline's pocket ticked steadily, marking moments that would soon become memories, counting down to a night that would change everything forever. Madeline's grandmother's cameo brooch rested against the hollow of her throat, its delicate carving catching the lamplight as she moved about her bedroom with careful deliberation. The piece had been worn by 3 generations of women on their wedding nights, each one entrusting her heart to a man she'd chosen to love. Tonight, though no ceremony had blessed their union, Madeline wore it as a bridge between past and present, honoring the courage of the women who'd come before while claiming her own right to love and be loved. The house had grown quiet as evening deepened into night. Jessie was downstairs, she knew, sitting by the fire and trying to calm nerves that had been stretched taut since their public declaration that afternoon. The weight of what they'd committed to, not just to each other, but to the entire town, pressed down on them both like a physical thing. Madeline caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her washstand and paused, studying the reflection that looked back at her. 58 years had left their mark in the silver threads that caught the lamplight, in the lines that mapped laughter and sorrow around her eyes, in the slight softening of a figure that had never known a man's touch. For a moment, doubt crept in like cold air through a window crack. What was she thinking, believing that someone like Jessie could truly desire someone like her? But then she remembered the way he'd looked at her during their confrontation with the townspeople. Not with the careful politeness she'd grown accustomed to, but with something that made her feel beautiful for the first time in decades. She remembered his declaration of love, spoken without hesitation despite the cost it might bring. And she remembered the promise they'd made to each other, the commitment to stop living half-lives in deference to other people's expectations. Soft knock at her door made her heart leap. "Madeline?" Jessie's voice was quiet, uncertain. "May I come in?" She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his hair still damp from washing, wearing the clean shirt she'd mended for him. That morning, in the gentle light from her oil lamp, he looked younger than his 30 years, vulnerable in a way that made her heart ache with tenderness. "I wasn't sure," he began, then stopped, his eyes finding the cameo at her throat. "You look beautiful." The simple words, spoken with such quiet reverence, melted the last of her self-consciousness. "Come in," she said, stepping back to allow him into the sanctuary of her private space. Jessie entered slowly, his eyes taking in the room that was so essentially her. The handmade quilt, the dried wildflowers in a simple vase, the stack of well-worn books on the bedside table. Everything spoke of a life lived thoughtfully, deliberately, with quiet grace. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because once this happens, we'll belong to each other in a way that has nothing to do with law or custom or anyone else's approval," Madeline finished for him. "Is that what frightens you?" Jessie shook his head. Slowly. "What frightens me is not being worthy of what you're offering. What frightens me is disappointing you, or hurting you, or—" Madeline silenced him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "Jessie," she said softly, "do you think I've lived 58 years without learning something about what I want? Do you think I'd risk everything? My reputation, my standing in this community, my comfortable, safe life, for something I wasn't absolutely certain about?" He captured her hand in his, pressing a kiss to her palm that made her shiver with anticipation. "I've never—" he began, then stopped, color rising in his cheeks. "Never what?" "Never been with a woman," he admitted, his voice rough with embarrassment. "I mean, I've known women, but never like this. Never with someone who mattered." The confession didn't surprise her. She'd sensed his inexperience in the careful way he touched her, in his hesitation when passion threatened to overwhelm propriety. But rather than concern, she felt a deep tenderness, a fierce protectiveness. "Abe, for this man who trusted her with his vulnerability. Then we'll learn together," she said, echoing the promise she'd made days earlier. "We'll take our time, and we'll be gentle with each other, and we'll remember that love isn't about perfection. It's about connection." Jessie studied her face in the lamplight, searching for any sign of doubt or regret. Instead, he found only warmth, acceptance, and something deeper, a love that saw past his inexperience to the man he was becoming under her patient guidance. "I love you," he said, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I love you. More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." "And I love you," Madeline replied, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "Not despite our differences, but because of them, because you make me brave enough to want things I'd given up hoping for." The space between them seemed to shimmer with possibility as Jessie reached up to cup her face in his hands. His thumbs traced the delicate curve of her cheekbones, marveling at the softness of skin that had weathered decades of prairie sun and wind, yet remained capable of such beauty. "Teach me," he whispered. And in those two words was a surrender so complete, so trusting, that Madeline felt her heart break open with love. The prairie wind through the open window carried with it the eternal songs of the grassland, the whisper of sage and sweet grass, the distant call of night birds, the vast breathing of a land that had witnessed countless cycles of love and loss, hope and fulfillment. Tonight, it seemed to Madeline, the very air blessed their union, wrapping around them like a benediction as old as time itself. What followed was a dance of discovery that transcended anything either of them had imagined. Jessie's hands, calloused from years of honest work, became instruments of reverence as he explored the landscape of Madeline's body with the same patient attention he might give to gentling a frightened horse. Every touch was a question, every response a gift freely given. Madeline found herself amazed by her own capacity for sensation, for the way her body responded to Jesse's touch as if it had been waiting all these years for exactly this moment, this man, this perfect convergence of heart and soul. The years seemed to fall away under his gentle ministrations, leaving only the essential truth of two people who had found in each other something rare and precious. Jesse's wonder was evident in every movement, every breath, every whispered endearment. This was love as he'd never imagined it could exist, not just the joining of bodies, but the complete surrender of souls. Madeline's patience, her guidance, her absolute acceptance of his inexperience transformed what might have been awkward into something sacred. "You're trembling," Madeline whispered, her hands framing his face as he hovered above her in the gentle lamplight. "I'm overwhelmed," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "By you, by this, by the fact that someone like you could love someone. Like me, someone like you," Madeline repeated, her voice carrying a note of wonder, "is exactly what my heart has been waiting for without knowing it. You're gentle where the world has made me careful, strong where I've learned to be self-sufficient, young where I've grown wise. We complete each other, Jesse." The truth of her words settled over them both like a warm blanket. This wasn't about age or circumstance or the opinions of others. This was about two souls recognizing their perfect match, two hearts that beat in perfect synchrony despite the years that separated their births. As their bodies joined in the ancient dance of love, the barriers that had kept them apart, propriety, fear, the weight of other people's expectations, crumbled completely. There was only this moment, this connection, this perfect union of hearts and souls that transcended everything else. Jesse felt himself transformed in Madeline's arms, no longer the drifting cowboy with no place to call home but a man beloved, a man who belonged somewhere at last. The careful control he'd maintained for so long dissolved under her loving touch, replaced by a vulnerability that was stronger than any armor he'd ever worn. Madeline discovered that her body, which she'd thought past such awakening, was capable of sensations that left her breathless with wonder. Every kiss, every caress, every whispered word of love seemed to unlock something she'd thought was lost forever. Not just passion, but the deep certainty that she was cherished, desired, truly seen for who she was. "I never knew," she breathed against his ear as waves of sensation washed over her. "I never knew it could be like this." "Neither did I," Jesse replied, his voice rough with emotion and desire. "I thought I understood what love was, but this is something else entirely." The prairie wind picked up, rustling the curtains and carrying with it the scent of rain on the horizon. But inside the small bedroom, time seemed suspended, the outside world held at bay by the power of what was happening between them. This was their moment, their perfect coming together, unmarked by doubt or regret or the complicated realities that would return with the dawn. As their passion reached its crescendo, Jesse and Madeline clung to each other with the desperate joy of people who had waited a lifetime for this connection. In that moment of complete unity, all the pain of the past, his years of rootless wandering, her decades of lonely resignation, was transformed into something beautiful, something that gave meaning to everything that had come before. They collapsed. Together afterward, hearts racing, bodies slick with perspiration, both of them amazed by the intensity of what they'd shared. Jesse gathered Madeline close, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how right this felt, despite everything that said it should be impossible. "What happens now?" Jesse asked quietly, his lips brushing against her temple. "Now we begin," Madeline replied, her voice soft but certain. "Now we start the life we chose together." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, gentle and steady, washing the dust from the prairie grass and filling the air with the sweet scent of new. Growth. It seemed fitting somehow. This cleansing rain on the night they'd finally claimed their happiness, this blessing from the vast sky that had witnessed their courage in reaching for love. As they lay entwined in the lamplight, listening to the raindrum softly against the windows, both Jessie and Madeline felt the deep satisfaction of souls that had found their home at last. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, its questions, its need to navigate a world that might never fully understand what they'd found in each other. But tonight belonged to them alone, to the love they'd been brave enough to claim, to the future they would build together, to the miracle of two hearts that had recognized their perfect match despite all the odds against them. The oil lamp flickered lower, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but neither moved to extinguish it. Let it burn, Madeline thought drowsily. Let it mark this moment when everything changed, when two lonely souls finally came home to each other at last. The new wedding ring gleamed on Madeline's finger, fashioned from her father's gold by the territory's finest craftsman, and bearing an inscription that only she and Jessie could read. Love chooses its own season. 6 months had passed since that transformative night when they'd claimed their happiness despite the world's objections, and the simple band served as daily proof that some dreams were worth waiting a lifetime to achieve. Bitter Creek had adjusted to their union with the grudging acceptance that small towns eventually show toward accomplished facts. The initial scandal had given way to practical considerations. Madeline's generosity had funded a new schoolhouse. Her medical knowledge had saved 3 lives during the winter fever outbreak, and Jessie's skill with horses had made him indispensable to half the ranchers in the county. It was hard to maintain moral outrage against people who'd become essential to the community's well-being. Mrs. Henderson still pursed her lips when she saw them together at Sunday service, but even she had been forced to admit that their devotion to each other was genuine when Jessie had nursed Madeline through a bout of pneumonia with the tender care of a man whose world revolved around his wife's well-being. Dr. Matthews had remarked privately that he'd never seen such dedicated nursing, and the story had spread through town like wildfire, softening even the hardest hearts. The homestead had been transformed as well, though the changes were subtle ones that spoke more of joy than of wealth. Jessie's tools hung in the barn beside Madeline's father's. His clothes shared space in the wardrobe with her dresses, and his harmonica rested on the mantelpiece beneath the wooden cross that had watched over so many years of solitude. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with conversation, laughter, and the comfortable sounds of 2 people building a life together. They'd been married by Reverend Morrison in a simple ceremony that half the town attended, curiosity, winning out over lingering disapproval. Madeline had worn her mother's dress, altered to fit her mature figure, while Jessie had stood beside her in his best suit, with tears streaming down his face as he promised to love and cherish her for all the days of his life. There had been no honeymoon trip. They'd had no desire to go anywhere else when they'd finally found home in each other. The revelation of Madeline's wealth had changed some things, but not the ones that mattered most. They still lived simply, though Jessie had convinced her to hire help with the heaviest chores and to purchase a few comforts that her years of self-denial had taught her to live without. The money was put to work in ways that honored the spirit in which it had been accumulated, quietly, thoughtfully, with an eye toward helping others without creating dependence. Jessie had established a fund for young men who wanted to learn trades, but lacked the means to get started, while Madeline had quietly begun paying for medical training for women who showed aptitude for healing. Neither sought recognition for their philanthropy. They'd learned that the most lasting help was the kind given without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. "You're thinking too hard again," Jessie observed from where he sat on the porch steps, tuning his harmonica in the evening light. Madeline looked up from the letter she'd been writing, correspondence with a banker in Denver about establishing a fund for war widows, and smiled at her husband. Even after 6 months, the word still gave her a thrill of wonder. Husband. At 58, she'd thought that ship had permanently sailed. Just wool gathering, she replied, setting aside her pen. Play something for me. Jessie obliged, choosing a melody that had become their song, something he'd composed in the weeks after their wedding, a tune that captured the contentment of souls that had found their perfect match. As the notes drifted across the prairie, Madeline reflected on how different her life had become since that night when a broken cowboy had stumbled to her door. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for 37 years had been replaced by a partnership that grew stronger with each passing day. Jessie had proven to be not just a devoted husband, but a true companion, someone who shared her values, appreciated her mind, and saw her not as the town spinster, but as a woman of worth and beauty. Their age difference, which had seemed so significant at first, had faded into irrelevance as they discovered the countless ways in which they complemented each other. Mrs. Potter asked me again today when we're going to give the town something to really talk about, Jessie said with a grin, finishing his tune. Madeline laughed, understanding his meaning. The speculation about whether their marriage might yet produce children had been a source of considerable gossip, though most people were too polite to ask directly. I told her we're perfectly content with things as they are, Madeline replied, though I suspect she was hoping for a different answer. Would you want children? Jessie asked quietly, and Madeline heard the genuine curiosity beneath the casual tone. I wanted them once, she admitted, when I was young and thought I had all the time in the world. But I've made my peace with other forms of legacy. She gestured toward the schoolhouse, visible in the distance, where children she'd taught were now growing into young adults, and toward the garden where she'd been experimenting with medicinal herbs that might help future generations of prairie dwellers. Besides, she added, with a smile that held no trace of regret, I've got you. That's family enough for any woman. Jessie set aside his harmonica and climbed the steps to settle beside her in the chair that had become their favorite spot for evening conversations. As the sun painted the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd ridden past that night instead of stopping? He asked. Madeline considered the question seriously, as she did all of Jessie's wonderings. I think we would have found each other eventually, she said finally. Some connections are too strong to be defeated by circumstance. You really believe that? I believe that love has its own wisdom, Madeline replied, touching the wedding ring that caught the last rays of sunlight. I believe that sometimes the heart knows things the mind hasn't figured out yet. And I believe that we were meant to find each other, even if it took 58 years for the timing to be right. As if summoned by their conversation, a coyote's howl rose from somewhere out on the prairie, no longer sounding lonely to Madeline's ears, but wild and free. Jessie's arm tightened around her, and she leaned into his warmth, marveling again at how perfectly they fit together. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain in its details, but certain in its foundation. They would face whatever came with the same courage that had brought them together, the courage to reach for love despite the odds, to build happiness despite the obstacles, to trust in something deeper than fear. And in the gathering dusk of another prairie evening, two souls who had been brave enough to claim their happiness sat together in perfect contentment, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast sky that had blessed their unlikely love.